they swore an oath to God to protect his name, his followers, and his kingdom. The military orders of the Crusades answered the call when threat of annihilation was hanging in the balance. In an all-new series, James and Joanna Bogle discuss the heroic efforts of the defense of ancient Christendom.
Europe is attacked from the north, from the south, from the east, and from the northeast as well. We really, literally have attacks on all sides.
So arose the military orders and the Crusades, an all-new series here on the Global Catholic Network, EWTN.
Hello and welcome to the Military Orders and the Crusades. I'm Joanna Bogle and this is my husband Jamie, and we're going to explore this fascinating and important part of our Christian traditions and heritage. Well, Jamie, it's a big subject.
Certainly is.
You have to go back more than 1,000 years of history. Do you suppose we should start by just setting the scene and looking at the whole origins of Christianity and the, how can one put it, the geopolitical reality of that whole part of the world that we associate with the Crusades?
Yes, well, I think the important thing to first realise with the Crusades is that there are a lot of myths surrounding that particular part of Christian history, or indeed the history of the world generally. First of all, it's often seen as an aggressive, invasive episode. It's often seen as a kind of colonial warfare, rather like something out of the 19th century. Of course, it was nothing like that at all. In fact, the truth of the matter is, it was a defensive war. It was a defensive war at a time when Christian Europe was in severe danger of being invaded from all sides. Not only from the east, because after all, most of, or at least half of Christianity was in the east, and Christianity itself began in the east. Indeed, it's probably right to say it's an Eastern religion, but also from the north and from the south.
I think we ought to pick up this thing about Christianity being Eastern. I mean, we know our Lord lived and was crucified and rose in Palestine, in what today we call the Middle East. And it seemed to me when I first grasped about this that we've got to change our understanding about Christianity and its cultural background. Christians, even 1,000 years ago, certainly 1,500 years ago, say 1,500 years ago, didn't think of Christianity as predominantly a European religion. I mean, it wasn't a religion for sort of, pink-faced people in Paris, as it were. It was, in its heart, the universal truth for all men and women. I mean, God made man. But it had begun in the Middle East. Yes. And any medieval map of Europe, I mean, going on for many, many centuries, not just the origins of this, would show Jerusalem at the heart of the map, rather than, say, London,
Right.
And I think it's important that we understand that this was Christian territory. What we today think of as Middle East, and use that expression, and why not? Nothing wrong with that. But the idea that it was Christian is very difficult for us, but it was Christian. And we can see this. I mean, we can see it from the letters of St. Paul and his great missionary journeys and so on, that this was a part of the world that was missionized by Christianity.
That's right. And as you say, the medieval maps, and indeed earlier maps in the time of the earlier Roman Empire, showed Jerusalem at the centre. Jerusalem was the city of Christ, where he suffered, and therefore of central importance to Christianity, as indeed it is, to be fair, to Judaism and Islam as well. But what we see with the situation of Christian Europe at the time of the Crusades is that it is physically under threat militarily. Most historians, or most writers these days, will talk about the Crusades beginning around about the time of the Council of Clermont, when, which was in 1095, when Blessed Urban II called the First Crusade, as if this were a kind of war of conquest. Nothing could be further from the truth. Really, our story begins as far back as even before the birth of Muhammad and before the great flight of Muhammad from Mecca to Medina, the so-called Hegira in the year 622. It really goes back even earlier than that, because the Eastern Roman Empire was under threat from similar attacks from the east. For example, the Persians under King Khosroes, and the Emperor Heraclius found himself as Emperor of the Eastern Empire under attack from the Persians. He eventually fought them off. They had stolen and taken the true cross. They had sacked Jerusalem, and this is what caused the Emperor Heraclius to summon his armies to defend Christendom. The same happened after the Hegira, when the Muslim Caliphate began to push east. And part of the beliefs of those early Muslims was that they had the true revelation of God, and that they were going to spread that to the world, if necessary, by the sword. And the Quran makes it quite clear that this is part of the doctrine of Islam. So we're looking well before the year 1095, before the First Crusade is called. And even at the time in 1095, what we're looking at is a period of immediate and acute danger to Christendom. And I'm talking about the Eastern Roman Empire as much as I am the West. In the West, of course, we also have the problems of the invasions of barbarians, previous centuries, sweeping across Northern Europe, eventually being Christianized, and especially the Franks, who subsequently become the great source of the Crusades and crusading soldiers. But also, don't forget, you've got the Vikings in the north invading Northern Europe. Some of them, of course, then become converted themselves, become the Northmen, the Normans, or who occupy northern France, and they too become part of the great crusading force in Palestine. But in the earlier part of Christian history, we can see the whole of Christian Europe is under significant threat.
And so if we want to look back, say, 500 years before that crusade called by Urban, who will be looking at all of that in much greater detail, what we now come to call the First Crusade, we'll be looking at that and indeed subsequent campaigns. But if we go back before that, say 500 years before, at the time when there is definitely a Christian culture in the Middle East and so on, Britain, for example, is not Christian. Within the lifetime of Muhammad, Augustine of Canterbury is converting the heathen Saxons, Ethelbert of Kent and his wife. Well, she was Christian. She was a princess from Gaul, from France. But while he is explaining to Ethelbert of Kent that there are not many gods but just one, and a saviour of us all, on the shores of southern England, Muhammad is already fleeing to Medina, and Islam is starting its huge surge in what is partly Christian territory. So we need to understand this. And meanwhile, up in the north of Europe, in Scandinavia, they are very much still pagans.
But not only there, but also in the Baltic regions. You have sweeping across Europe, you have Swabians, Franks, Avars. Later on you get, earlier still you get the Huns and the Goths, and then later you get the Magyars. All of these, remember, are pagan tribes who are savagely persecuting, some worse than others, some subsequently become converted. And then, at the same time, coinciding during this period, you get the rise of Islam. And what we eventually see in the 11th century is the eclipse of the Byzantine Roman Empire. And don't forget, from about the 5th century, the Roman Empire has divided into East and West. And so the Eastern Empire becomes, if you like, something of a bulwark against invaders from the East, coming from the steppes of Asia. But increasingly, it's unable to maintain this position. And of course, you also have the beginnings of the religious divide between East and West, eventually culminating in 1054 with the Great Schism. What happened was that the Eastern Romans began to drift away from the papacy, from Rome and from the authority of Rome, and began to set up what we now see and recognize as the Greek and Russian and other Orthodox autonomous churches. And from the very beginning, and even to some extent, I suppose, today, they were very hostile. This created many difficulties and many complicating factors, as we will see as we go on with our history of the Crusades. But what we see only a matter of something like 20 years later, after the Great Schism, is the Battle of Manzikert in 1071 in Anatolia, which is now Turkey. And there we see the eclipse of the Byzantine army, and the emperor himself is taken prisoner. And that becomes a clarion call, not only to obviously the Byzantine Empire, but to the Eastern Empire and the Western Empire and the Christians in the West, who also can see the immediate threat from the invading Muslim Caliphate. Arabs at this stage, at an earlier stage, and by the time of the Battle of Manzikert, we're looking at invasions by the Turks. This is the immediate threat, which results only 20 years later, or 25 years later, in a perception of an immediate threat to the security and safety of Western Europe, and in particular of Christendom as a whole, which results in the Council of Clermont.
This is very important because one of the tragedies of the Crusades as they were to develop was that what could have brought the two sides of Christianity together, in the end, the events as they played out, and I'm not saying, not apportioning blame, but as they played out, the schism was to worsen through the tragic events of the Crusades. And it is a great pity because it began with a certain degree of at least potential for goodwill between East and West. There must have been, I think, a feeling that the healing would take place because of the commitment to campaign against this common enemy. And with our hindsight now, when a major priority for the Church, for John Paul and for Pope Benedict, has been precisely to heal divisions between East and West Christendom, and of course, in an increasingly shrinking world, television, internet, to have as much goodwill and dialogue as possible with people under Islam and with Jewish people, and there's masses of potential for that, which is great. But it's difficult. We have to think back to a very different era.
We do.
To a very different geopolitical situation.
And we also need to remember that this constant theme that is now, you mentioned, the present Pope and his predecessor, of seeking reconciliation is not something new. It's not something that has never existed, except in our times. Throughout the history of Christendom, even during the height of the Crusades, we would see many crusading kings like King Louis, Saint Louis of France, attempting to resolve issues without warfare.
Yes.
And of course this is promoted by the Church and by the popes themselves. And we see this even with St. Bernard of Clairvaux, who himself wrote a work praising the new knighthood, as he called it, De Laude Novae Militiae, in praise of the new knighthood. And he's talking about the order of the Knights Templar. And let me just read you something from what St. Bernard says in that work, because I think it's quite instructive of the mentality of even somebody who so strongly supported the Crusades. This is addressed to the master of the Knights Templar, to Hugh, Knight of Christ and Master of Christ's Militia. He says this is, as I say, a new kind of knighthood, and one unknown to the ages gone by. It ceaselessly wages a twofold war, both against the flesh and blood and against a spiritual army of evil in the heavens. Indeed, danger or victory for a Christian, he says, depends on the disposition of the heart and not on the fortunes of war. If he fights for a good reason, the issue can never be evil. Likewise, the results can never be considered good if the reason were evil and the intention perverse. If you happen to be killed while you are seeking only to kill another, you die a murderer. If you live a murderer. But either way, it's wrong, says St. Bernard. Even in his own work on the praise of the new knighthood, he says, I do not mean to say that pagans are to be slaughtered when there is any other way to prevent them from harassing, persecuting, and slaughtering the faithful. What then? Does this mean we should simply do nothing? No, says St. Bernard. It is permissible for a Christian to defend himself, and he quotes scripture. He says, did not the Saviour's precursor, and he's talking about John the Baptist here, bid the soldiers to be content with their pay, rather than forbidding them to pursue their profession of arms? And so that's St. Bernard himself saying that.
And you've got the echo here, unchanged right to our present day, of the whole concept of a just war and decency within war, and also the idea that war is not something we should go for in its own self. It's not something that Christ willed as a jolly good thing to do as often as we possibly can. It's the necessary defence of the innocent. It's interesting because a number of writers have explored and commented on this, but of course not very fashionable to do so today. And Father Nicholas Schofield, who is, by the way, the archivist of the Diocese of Westminster in London, a very good historian, he wrote a very good article for Faith magazine, which I found helpful, and he quotes another writer, Thomas Madden, saying that the Crusade was an errand of mercy, liberating the Christians of the East from their Muslim conquerors. In other words, the Crusades were, from the beginning, a defensive war. The entire history of the Eastern Crusades is one of response to Muslim aggression. And I think that to me was putting something in context that I hadn't otherwise seen. It's very tempting to see things through the lens of the modern filmmaker's camera or the current cliché, rather than this more complex and, of course, more interesting, although at times incredibly tragic, history.
Well, yes, and I believe I'm right in saying he has in mind a recent film called, I think, The Kingdom of Heaven, a Hollywood blockbuster, which again has certainly a measure of truth in some parts of it, because not all of the history of the Crusades is a rosy picture. But equally, it errs perhaps in going too far in the other direction, showing the Christians as an aggressive force, corrupt, intolerant, even in some cases bordering on the insane. This is a very superficial picture of what really happened. It's very easy to take out a small section of history, a few rogue individuals, and build a bigger picture, as if that were the true story of the whole Crusades. Quite apart from anything else, the Crusades, if you were to say that they began with the Council of Clermont and Blessed Urban II's call for the First Crusade in 1095, go on right up until the end of the 18th century. But even that isn't the full picture, because as we've seen, it really goes right the way back before even the birth of Muhammad. These are, in effect, crusades. And then the word crusade itself, coming from the Italian for one who wears the cross, which after the First Crusade tended to be something that crusaders did, and particularly the military orders, which we're going to get onto, is a word, this word crusade, that is invented by later historians. You might equally apply it, for example, to the Emperor Heraclius retrieving the true cross, or the Emperor Justinian trying to recover parts of North Africa, or parts of his empire in the East. But it has been classically used to deal with a period from the Council of Clermont. And in particular, we see it in relation to the rise of the religious military orders, the two principal ones being, of course, the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller. And we've already seen what St. Bernard said when he wrote to the Master of the Knights of the Temple, or the Knights Templar. And we'll come on to that a little bit later on in this series.
And this idea of the military religious orders is very interesting, and has, of course, given the Church and Western life in particular all sorts of quite attractive, flawed, because nothing is ever perfect, everything is marked by original sin, but quite attractive ideas of uniformed men pledged to the service of protecting the weak and doing what is good, right down to some thoroughly good sort of modern things, ranging from the Knights of St. Columba and Knights of Columbus to the Boy Scouts. There's still this concept of, if you like, the man in uniform holding high the cross. It's also a pity that the word crusade gets used very glibly, and again Father Schofield refers to this, very much in modern parlance. Any politician launching a campaign is liable to call it a crusade. So you may have a crusade against drugs, a crusade against litter. And I've done this. I've announced we're going to have a crusade against, well, it was in fact litter, picking up litter in the street. Well, it would be nice to pick up litter in the street, which doesn't necessarily have to be given that cliché word of picking up litter isn't necessarily crusade. I think this idea then that we're seeing it as more complex, stretching over a far longer period of history and going back a great way before the calling of what we now call the First Crusade under Urban. Of course, he didn't call it the First Crusade. These are merely useful labels given by future historians. I think this this helps, doesn't it, to set the scene. But there are not just a few modern commentators saying that we should get this right. Serious historians for many years have also looked at this, because G.K. Chesterton also made this point, in which he said we need to understand that Christendom was the thing invaded, not the invader.
Well, actually, I have a quote here from Chesterton, since you mentioned him, which I think is apposite. He says this: when people talk as if the Crusades were nothing more than an aggressive raid against Islam, they seem to forget, in the strangest way, that Islam itself was only an aggressive raid against the old and ordered civilization in those parts, i.e. in Mesopotamia and in the Eastern Roman Empire. I do not say it in mere hostility to the religion of Muhammad. I am fully conscious of many values and virtues in it, but certainly it was Islam that was the invasion and Christendom that was the thing invaded.
And this sets the scene and is a useful, as Chesterton so often does, writing in rather good English prose, sums it up in a way that is going to be useful to us. It is a problem, of course, that because human beings will insist on being human and not angels, that deeds of groups or individuals mar the narrative that ought to be a noble one. In response to cruelty, we gather round and rally against it. But we see this also in the modern church. It only takes one or two deeply unpleasant people to wreck some useful campaign or event. It only takes a few wicked individuals to mar something splendid and noble in the church or in society even today, and it will probably always be this way. It's a call to us all to behave well, but nothing strange there. Last time I looked, original sin was there at the Crusades, and it's there now.
Well, you'll be pleased to know that St. Bernard agrees with you, going back to his De Laude Nove Militia in praise of the new knighthood, that's the Knights Templar. He said this, and he's talking about Christians here, about Catholic Christians. Indeed, the true Israelite is a man of peace, even when he goes forth to battle. Now that sounds a bit contradictory, but if we think in terms of the just war as developed by St. Augustine, as developed by St. Thomas Aquinas, and is now adopted by the Church itself, you read in the Universal Catechism of the Catholic Church, a description of what constitutes a just war, it's essentially defensive. Sometimes you have to go on the offensive in order to defend yourself, because if you don't, you will be unable to defend yourself. And so St. Bernard says, thus in a wondrous and unique manner they appear gentler than lambs, yet fiercer than lions. Indeed, they lack neither monastic meekness nor military might. And this is why he wrote his letter to Hugh de Payens, because it's a new idea, the idea of the military religious orders. And that's what we're going to go on to explore, this new idea of something which appears to be in conflict with itself. When you unravel it, you see that it makes sense.
And while we're looking at this new idea, which is also this rather marvellous concept of chivalry and knighthood, which has given so much to the world and to our own heritage, we will also have to remember where we're looking. We're looking around the Mediterranean, we're looking at southern Europe as it borders onto North Africa, we're looking above all, of course, to the Holy Land. So we would be looking at the world in the first millennium and into the beginning of the second millennium. We're looking at a Europe where the Normans are conquering and have just conquered England, Battle of Hastings, 1066, this sort of era. And we're looking as well at the extraordinary task of conveying people right across the landlocked part of Europe and then across to the Holy Land. So therefore there are sea journeys around the Mediterranean and so on. And there is this great movement of armies across Europe. I'm just trying to sort of set the scene. And it's in this context that we will eventually have this rallying call and this very powerful message of St. Bernard as to what it is to be a Christian knight, how we should do this humbly, with peace in our hearts, recognizing that we should only be doing this from the best of motives.
Indeed. And also showing that this is distinctly different from the purely worldly idea of knighthood, which is one of conquest and perhaps even of sometimes lapsing into brutality. He wants to set his ideal of a Christian knight, particularly the military religious orders, well away from that abuse of power which he and the Church and all the best authorities of the Church have always condemned.
Right up to and including, of course, the present day. So we're looking here at something which is going to give us insights into chivalry. We think of Chaucer's very Parfit Gentle Knight, our own history, and also the history of the Holy Land with the results that we see today, and of course actual physical results, the remains of the Crusader castles in the Holy Land, and the places across Europe today that are linked with these. We think of the Temple Church in London connected with the Knights Templar, and then we also think of all the gibberish, I'm sorry, but gibberish, you know,
yes.
Da Vinci Code and hidden secrets of the Templars and all the other stuff that if you wanted to you can find out there on the internet and out there in the sort of pseudo-mythology of the junk of our time. So this is going to be a good series
Indeed.
of discussions.
It's not only the junk of our time, but certainly there's a lot of that, but also it is very much a fundamental part of our Christian history,
yes.
one which runs like a strong thread all the way through. The defence of the kingdom of Christ on earth, with all its flaws, but nonetheless requiring to be defended. And that's really what we must remember. We must go back to the call of Blessed Urban II, which was essentially a defensive call. Remember, he was asked by the emperor himself in the East, the Eastern emperor, for aid and assistance to defend the Eastern Christians from the Muslim attacks.
And this was not a Christianity which saw itself as European. This was a Christianity which saw itself as being universal. This had absolutely no connotations of European superiority, but rather was dealing with people who were Middle Eastern. And the call was the call of Christ, which is universal. And we should free ourselves from our sort of modern geographical religious map and recognise the way things really were, with that heartland of the faith being that the lands where Christ himself had walked and lived and preached. Join us next time for the military orders and the Crusades, when we look at the rise of Islam.